It was like a dream. One that would send Mackenzie down a slippery slope into a nightmare. Working at her desk on history homework that she enjoyed, and dredging the math that was next on the list, a crackle erupted from behind her, making her flinch. Turning around, her eyes widened in shock. A portal. That was the word to come to her mind. From all the movies she'd seen, the books she'd read, the legends she'd heard tell of. A glowing, flickering oval, out of which stepped a young woman. Her appearance seemed out of a medieval tale, her brown hair thick with curls, wearing a dress that looked like something Mackenzie would see at Casual Friday at a Renaissance fair. The only word Mackenzie managed, and it brought understanding to the woman in front of her. You are Mackenzie Braun. Yeah, she cleared her throat. That's me. My name is Raja Hanania. Your help is needed. Mackenzie followed. How could she not? The path that stood poised to set her on an adventure sat right in front of her, ready to be seized. And no movie had ever ended with those who were called to action turning it down. The main character never dismissed the person, saying, "No, I've got homework." That was hollow, absurd, and there was barely any hesitation before the 16-year-old took the woman's hand, walking into another world. It was a place of magic and wonders. At first glance, it was as if she'd been transported back in time. The animals on farms, the outfits centuries out of date. But among all of that was the unmistakable difference of the existence of magic. The residents watched Mackenzie with awe as they walked through the village, a short walk, to the nearby castle. That was the beginning, dreamlike and surreal. A formal ceremony awaited them. Mackenzie was seated on a throne just her size, and a crown was placed on her head. And that's when everything hit her at once. The crown wasn't just a conduit. It was the encapsulation of warriors past. Mackenzie's spine straightened, and every muscle tensed, as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her fingers wrapped around the armrests of the throne in a white-knuckle grip. She couldn't breathe. A torrent of energy and memories and abilities inundated her, her brain absorbing information and emotion from every direction. It felt like hours, but when Mackenzie blinked, taking in a long gasp of air, leaning over and clasping her knees tightly in her hands, as she strained to calm her racing heart, she realized it had been seconds. Raja removed the crown, placing it in a cushioned box held by a young man, who quickly took it away. Her eyes teary, Mackenzie slid her gaze to the woman who had escorted her here, Raja. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me? I'm just a child. I can't." "The crown never leads us astray," Raja said confidently. "Your soul is what called you to us." Mackenzie blinked slowly several times, swallowing hard. "The war." Raja nodded once. "The war. How long do we have?" "Our generals have been preparing for several days, but there are weeks left until the first battle." Raja tilted her head. "You've seen all and you felt all. You will protect the people of this land." The teenager in Mackenzie's mind was still there, but she stood crouched against the walls of the mind that had been overtaken by the knowledge of past warriors, of those who had come before her. The girl knew the feeling and weight of a sword in her hand, had the experience of years of hand-to-hand combat, could imagine the tension of a bow before she loosened an arrow. Raja saw the rift struggling to resolve in Mackenzie's mind, and took a few steps over, kneeling beside her. "If you trust in the crown, we will be guided to victory and to peace. All we need is our leader. Will you lead us, as those before you have done, Mackenzie Braun?" At that question, a surge of emotion bubbled up from Mackenzie, and determination set her eyes firmly on the woman in front of her. "You can call me Mac," she said softly. "Show me to my quarters, and then we will consult with the generals." Mackenzie's knowledge and instincts were impeccable, and just as Raja had assured her, she looked over the maps with eyes that saw everything. But they also saw the future, the knowledge that this would not end quickly. The lands were vast, the people zealous, and some fanatical. This war would soak the ground with blood for ages. It was a painfully long struggle, and the battles raged on, documented facetiously by a historian that Mackenzie worked with for an hour at the end of every week. Mackenzie led countless armies into battle, and despite nicks and bruises and close calls, her sword and arrows and shield never failed to take down her enemy and protect her. Guided by the knowledge of thousands of warriors before her, she stood her ground and defended her lands. Even through retreats and defeats, they marched forward. Then, there was a woman, Miser. She was a warrior, but stood out among the rest, and Mackenzie felt the woman's instincts were far beyond those of her peers. She was invited to assist in the war room, a large sanctuary in the castle that usually hosted parties, which were few and far between these days. Though, of course, after a battle victory, the soldiers needed to express the joy of victory, to savor it, to give them the confidence and drive to continue the fight. Otherwise, Mackenzie knew, they would empty of everything they had inside and collapse, husks that held only vacant souls. Those who were friends with their leader were wary of Mackenzie's closeness with a fellow soldier. To fall in love in war was a dangerous thing indeed, and Raja encouraged her to keep her eyes forward and not to stray. But their love grew, Miser eventually sharing Mackenzie's bed, and there was even talk that they would marry. The day came for a battle that Mackenzie had painstakingly mapped out, fairly convinced that their spies had retrieved knowledge that would let them catch the enemy off guard. But there was a betrayal among the ranks, a soldier that Mackenzie only knew in passing, and it seemed he had let greed overtake his love of his fellow soldier and his country. The battle would have been a slaughter, but for the well-trained soldiers and Mackenzie's sixth sense, guiding her to an early retreat. And yet she lost what mattered to her most. Miser was struck down. A sword slit cleanly through her abdomen before the enemy dismissed her as a fallen soldier and moved on. Mackenzie recalled screaming her name, desperately attempting to stem the bleeding before lifting the woman over her shoulders, blood soaking into the back of her uniform, and carrying her hurriedly among the other soldiers in retreat. By the time they reached safe ground and Mackenzie lowered her to the ground, Miser's eyes were empty. The commander wailed in despair, hugging her love tightly to her chest as she sobbed. Soldiers around them removed their helmets in respect, remaining silent as their leader mourned. Mackenzie dreamt of Miser's eyes that night, cold and vacant, blood flowing from her wound endlessly, drowning them in the flood. And yet the war continued. It always continued, day after day, week after week, month after month, and ultimately year after year. Until they gained an advantage, until strategy won out in the end. Patience, intelligence, and, of course, the wisdom of the crown that had chosen a fitting leader for its people. One night, as Mackenzie stood on the terrace of her castle's bedroom, gazing out across the land, Raja came to her side. "Mac," she spoke softly, "the soldiers and their families, they await a speech from their leader in the Great Hall." "I have no speech," Mackenzie murmured. She leaned on the rough stone railing, refusing to look at her friend. "I have no family, I have no love, I have no victory." "Of course you—" "It's not my victory," she said. "It is that of my people. I was promised a return to the life I had before, that of a child, and I miss my family dearly and do wish to return. But what then?" Mackenzie finally slid her eyes to Raja's. "How does one simply exchange one life for another?" "You told me it was a life of peace," Raja said, "of simple joys and friends and family, of love. You told me stories of how you miss it." I do very much," Mackenzie sighed, looking back to the dark acreage surrounding the castle, lit only by a crescent moon. I'm just not quite sure that it misses me." Raja blinked in confusion and remained silent. And so it was that the treaties were signed to ensure peace among the lands, 9.5 years in the making. Raja walked with Mackenzie to say her final goodbye to Miser's grave, which took longer than they had expected. Mackenzie had a hard time tearing herself away from the headstone, one last time. They went to the village, to the wizard who worked in that little shack that Mackenzie had first exited from so long ago. With a prick of blood from her finger, the spell brought forth the portal, the glow calling to her. The commander of the land's armies wrapped her arms tightly around her closest advisor, hugging her for a long moment, before abruptly turning and walking through the portal. Her room was unchanged. Her homework lay unfinished upon her desk. Her trinkets and books lined the shelves. Clothes she wore long ago piled mostly into her laundry basket, but some carelessly on the floor. Mackenzie walked slowly over to the family photo on her wall, fingers brushing against it. Her father, her mother, her brother. Mackenzie glanced in a mirror above her dresser, shocked at what she saw. Her years were on her face no longer, truly having been sent back in time. The tight muscles built from years of war weakened to that of merely an avid tennis player. The hair she cut short for battle hung to her shoulders, and the scars of blades and nicks of arrows vanished, as if it hadn't happened, as if it was all a dream and it had forgotten her. But she couldn't forget it. Each death she witnessed, each fallen soldier under her command, every drop of blood, they were all burned into her mind with a branding iron. Even the knowledge that the crown had bestowed on her hadn't faded. Her vision tilted a bit and she grabbed for the wall, stabilizing herself. Then she slowly but surely made her way over to the bed, and she put a pillow to her face and screamed. Mackenzie screamed until her throat grew sore, until she had no more energy to make a sound. She curled up and lay limply on her bed, staring at the wall, clean and white, trying to make her surroundings familiar again, trying to remember the insignificant thoughts that had occupied her mind day to day when this had been her home, trying to imagine what could have compelled her to become a commander of an army she had never known. But of course, the answers came despite her. Those she'd saved, the ones too young to fight, too young to even know of what happened outside the castle walls. The ones who had never seen a bloody corpse or heard a horse screaming as it died, and hopefully, the ones who never would. "Mac? Knock knock," spoke a voice. Mackenzie rolled in her bed and laid her eyes upon her mother. She'd kicked herself for forgetting to do something as simple as bring a photo all those years ago. But of course she hadn't had an idea how long she would be gone. Her mother's face was utterly familiar, and yet somewhat foreign, as if Mackenzie's instincts were telling her 10 years should have passed for this woman as well. Helena Braun spoke more, but Mackenzie didn't hear her. She slid out of bed, her footsteps rapid as she ran to her mother, and grabbed her in a tight hug and started to sob. "Oh, sweetheart," Helena cried, clutching her tightly. "What happened? What's wrong?" "A bad dream," Mackenzie managed to choke out between sobs. "A horrible, horrible dream." "Oh, wow. If you fell asleep this early, you must have been exhausted," Helena muttered, rubbing her daughter's back. Mackenzie soaked in her mother's love, the movement of her hand on her back, simple yet all-encompassing comfort that she hadn't felt for years. "Okay, mental health time. Skip the rest of your homework and... you want me to bring you some cookies and milk, maybe?" Mackenzie attempted to regulate her breathing, her chest shuddering as she did so. "Can you just lie with me?" she whispered. "Like when I was a little girl?" "Of course, honey, come on." Helena guided her daughter over to her bed and snuggled up behind her, a comforting arm around her waist, and Mackenzie held her hand. "Can you tell me about your day?" My day? Helena asked in surprise. Sure, but the life of a pharmaceutical saleswoman isn't all that exciting. The more boring the better, Mackenzie said quietly. I just want to hear about your life. Helena obliged, and Mackenzie let the words fill her, trying to fill the void inside her made from everything she'd left behind on the battlefields. Everything she'd left in that other world. When her mother started to trail off, she held tight to the conversation, asking follow-up questions, learning things Helena had surely never thought she'd be explaining to her daughter. The safety and security of being home wrapped around Mackenzie like a warm blanket, and she soaked it all in. Eventually, she stopped prompting her mother to continue. Eventually, her eyes lowered, her heart rate slowed, and she drifted off to sleep. The next thing she remembered was screaming herself awake in the early hours of the morning. Helena and her husband Lionel rushed into the room, and it was Helena who quickly embraced her daughter, picking up from where they left off earlier. Mackenzie shook with adrenaline, sobbing as her mother held her. And she despaired, because this life was no longer hers. The universe had taken her from it, made her into something new, and dropped her back in as if she was still fit. But no. She'd had nightmares in the other world regularly, even night terrors, after Miser had been killed. Relentless, crushing fear drowning her until she gasped for the air of consciousness. She would talk endlessly to Raja, but it wasn't what she needed. It didn't calm her soul. Mackenzie slowly absorbed the fact that she was a soldier coming home. She knew what that meant. She knew, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that the battles of blood were over, but she was now fated to a war of another kind. One inside her head. One that was not going to mercifully fade away with enough sleep, or enough food, or enough company. She was cursed with a burden that no one who cared for her would understand. And it was going to take a long, long time for her to be able to accept this life she'd made it back to as the gift it could be. Helena and Lionel consoled their daughter and eventually left the room, but Mackenzie left the bedside light on, looking at the clock on her bedside table. 4:34 a.m. She knew she wouldn't sleep any more that night, and that sleep would continue to evade her, just as it often did back at the kingdom. Swallowing hard, she got up and went over to the open history textbook on her desk. With a lack of anything else to do, she flicked on her desk lamp, turning back to the beginning of the chapter, and started to read. Mackenzie Braun was dropped off at my office by her mother, Helena, who then went off to run errands. Unsurprising, considering our hour-long session. I took in the girl in front of me. Anyone passing her on the street would sense something different, something off. Her muscles tensed too tight, her eyes hyper-aware, her stance wary and untrusting. And the striking change had happened overnight, her mother had said. The day before the first session, I had spoken with Mackenzie's mother, who told me she had allowed her daughter to choose the new psychologist she would be seeing. There had been 2 others, but after 2 sessions with each, Mackenzie had refused to attend any more, which prompted her mother's new strategy. The history I'd read over from the last 2 psychologists gave the impression of a teenage girl I wouldn't expect to visit my office for anything besides something like a genetic mental imbalance. Her family was small but strong. A father and mother who both worked. The father in carpentry, longer hours than would be ideal it seemed, but he was present in the family's day-to-day life. Helena was in pharmaceuticals, and Mackenzie had a brother 3 years younger, Joey. Both he and his sister had above-average school grades. Well, at least they had, until Mackenzie had woken up one day a new person. Helena told me that morning she thought Mackenzie gravely ill, but a trip to the doctor showed nothing physically wrong with her. Time off from school was spent mostly in bed or watching television. clearly illustrating that something in the girl's head was damaged. "I chose you for a reason," Mackenzie said, as she walked into my office. She didn't even wait to sit down, and my eyes went to her curiously as I shut the door behind us. "And it wasn't because of anything about you. I mean, you seem like a decent psychologist. I wouldn't have chosen you otherwise, but it's more than that. It's about where this office is. We need to do something before we start our first session." I took in her demeanor, her stance confident, stiff, and yet vulnerable in a way I couldn't place. "What's that, Mackenzie?" I asked. "I prefer Mac." My eyebrows went up, and I nodded in understanding. "There's a mixed martial arts studio downstairs in this plaza," she told me. "You know it?" "Never been inside, but I've seen them. Why?" "I need you to humor me. Can you?" Hesitant, but knowing this poor girl was on her third psychologist, I slowly nodded. "Yes, you'd like to have our session there?" "Not exactly." At that, she simply turned and left back out through the door she'd come in. I didn't realize I hadn't even grabbed my notepad until we were halfway down the staircase outside, but I dismissed it. I could always go back to get it if needed, or, lacking that, jot down notes on my phone for transfer later. We entered the gym. Dojo, was that the word? Through the glass double doors, and Mackenzie raised a hand toward the man at the front desk in greeting. The gym was empty, though it was 2 p.m., and I would have thought it would be filled with practicing students at this time of day. "Mac," the man spoke, walking quickly over and shaking her hand. That was curious. How did this man know her? Has she trained here? Her mother hadn't mentioned anything like that. "Clear the gym at your request." The man looked at me, holding out his hand, which I shook. "Jarir Qureshi. Everyone calls me Jar." "Dr. Veronica Sivikova," I said. "I'm at a loss, admittedly. This is supposed to be Mac's first therapy session." "She explained," Jarir interrupted me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We met last week, and, in the interest of honesty, her mother doesn't know she came here. We had a sparring of sorts, and Mac told me she needed to show what she knows to someone who'd be coming with her today. That's all I really know." I took a moment to absorb that information. All right. "You can sit there," Mackenzie said, motioning to a chair off against the wall. I nodded once, walking over and taking a seat, as she retied her ponytail tight against her head. "We'll start with basic sparring?" "Sounds good," Jarir answered. Mackenzie left her socks and shoes near where I was seated, and she and Jarir went to the center of the mats. Mackenzie gently stretched her muscles for about a minute, and presumably Jarir had just had classes, so he was already limber and ready to go. They bowed formally, and then they began. And my vision swam. I need to be clear here. I'm not someone who's ever trained in martial arts. All I know of this discipline is an all-female self-defense class I took once as a young woman, which was well over a decade ago. But the thing that struck me as I watched the display before me with wide eyes was something that one of the instructors had told me that day. Any martial arts discipline is about one thing: repetition. It's muscle memory, because fights happen fast. If you know how to block an attack, but your brain doesn't do it instinctively, you may as well not know how to do it at all. The stunning display I was watching told me Mackenzie Braun knew how to fight in a way that mattered. Mackenzie and Jarir flew in a tangle of limbs, regularly taking a moment to spread some distance between each other before resuming their attacks and defensive techniques. My mind spun through what I knew of this child from my files. She'd lived in the suburbs for her whole life, in her current home for the past 10 years. Her friends were approved of by her parents, no worries in that department, even though she was 16, and that was a tricky age as she was starting in earnest to figure out who she was as a person. She played tennis and enjoyed crossword puzzles, and her mother said when asked Mackenzie's go-to answer for what she wanted to be when she grew up was something to do with animals, though she was flailing a bit in the wide variety of fields open to her in that regard. This was not that girl. Her eyes were stone, her moves were fluid, her appearance holding a confidence of someone twice her age. It was stunning and, alarmingly, almost beautiful in the way they fought, a dance of strikes and parries. Then, after just a few minutes, though it seemed in retrospect to have been much longer, they took a few strides apart and nodded to each other subtly. Mackenzie turned to me, her eyes holding something difficult for me to pass as her chest heaved, trying to flood her body with the oxygen that had been so quickly depleted. After a few long moments of me staring back at her, she spoke. "My mum has never seen me do that. I didn't want to show her what... I didn't want her to understand that I..." She pursed her lips, deciding to put the thoughts aside instead of trying to verbalize them. I nodded, jerkily, trying to absorb what was happening, but there wasn't much time. Jarir walked over to the other side of the room, where I saw a piece of wood several inches thick nailed to the wall, painted as a target. A shelf underneath held several plastic boxes, and the man took one of them, bringing them over to Mackenzie, who stood about 20 feet away from the target. Leaving the box at the girl's feet, I realized it had throwing knives inside. She took a handful of them and, one by one, without hesitation and without fail, flicked them hilt over tip and stuck them in the bullseye of the target. Not on top of each other, but in a careful arrangement so they could each penetrate the wood without jarring the others. I let out a sharp breath in shock. "How's this one?" Jarir spoke, drawing my gaze. "My guy said you'd probably like it." I saw him with a crossbow in his hands, and Mackenzie hefted it slightly, feeling it out, and she nodded. "Not bad." He handed her 3 arrows, which she held in her left hand, and waited as he went to the target, pulling the knives from where they stuck. Mackenzie waited until he was fully clear, then pulled an arrow into the crossbow, pulling it back and aiming a few times, as if getting a feel for the tool in her arms. Then finally, she loosed each arrow, one after another, each hitting the bullseye in even closer proximity than the knives. At this point, my hands were shaking, because Helena had told me what Mackenzie had told her. Of course she had, every detail, and I knew everything Mackenzie had explained to the last 2 psychologists. She'd been taken to another world, lived 10 years there as a warrior, destined to save a people of this foreign land, and then was returned once her calling had been fulfilled. And with each second that ticked by, a heavy dread sunk lower and lower into my stomach. "You have the synthetics, right?" Mackenzie asked Jarir, not giving me any attention at this point. "Yeah, though I'm a bit rusty, so you've got to go easy on me," he told her. Mackenzie smirked, and my mind grabbed onto that facial expression, sensing something important behind it. I memorized it, taking it apart mentally and psychologically, for the few moments it took for Jarir to go to his closet and fetch 2 swords. Fake swords, dull and mostly harmless, but still. Again, they flew in a symphony of steel that sang with each strike, a staggering sight to witness, and my breath caught in my throat as I spotted strategic moves on the part of each of them. The jousting escalated in speed, until a movement I didn't fully catch with my eye ended abruptly, with Mackenzie's sword against Jarir's waist. They lowered their weapons, bowed, and Mackenzie turned to me. I stared back at her with wondrous, stunned eyes, and as she met my gaze, I saw something shift in them. An understanding of what I'd absorbed, a comprehension on my part, and relief. The child was relieved, as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders, that she had been carrying for longer than I could imagine. Mackenzie's breathing was still quick, her heart no doubt pounding rapidly in her chest from exertion, as she walked over to me, picking up the chair beside me and putting it down so we were almost facing each other when she sat in it. Dr. Sivakova? Yes, I asked. The teenage girl licked her lips anxiously, the moment stretching. I need help, she whispered. I saw something in her eyes at that point. Something deep and treacherous, heavy and oppressive. Something worthy of nightmares and flashbacks and exhaustion that would lead to just one of two things: recovery or complete mental collapse. Swallowing hard, I slowly nodded. Mac? I took a breath. There's something here that's beyond me, beyond any training I've received as a psychologist. I don't know what happened to you. I don't know what you went through, how you suffered, or who you lost. Her face crumpled, and tears glazed over her eyes at that. But, if you're willing to walk me through everything you've gone through, I know how to help you. PTSD can be a monster to fight, especially for someone your... I paused, realizing that wasn't quite right. Especially for someone who was thrown into something of this magnitude at such a young age, I amended. You believe me? She breathed. A shadow of distrust hung behind her eyes. I can't not believe you, I answered. Her lower lip trembled with the threat of tears, and she averted her gaze. Mac? She looked back to me. You'll be seeing me twice a week, starting immediately. We'll start the process of giving you the tools to make it through day to day, and you'll have all the help you need. All the help any soldier deserves.